In a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood on the south side of Chicago, an elderly man named Walter Johnson lived alone in a small, weathered house. His home wasn't fancy. It had chipped paint on the door and cracks in the driveway, but it was filled with memories. Walter had lived there for over 2 decades, raising his children and watching them grow into successful adults. Now at 76 years old, he spent most of his days tending to his garden, reading books by the window or taking slow walks around the block with his cane. Walter was known for his gentle smile and kind demeanor, but not everyone saw him that way. Some neighbors whispered about him behind closed doors, casting suspicious glances whenever he passed by. They didn't know much about him, only that he was black and lived quietly, which somehow made him stand out. Walter had grown accustomed to these looks over the years. He knew people judged him based on the color of his skin rather than who he truly was. It hurt sometimes, but he chose to rise above it. After all, he had lived through worse. Born in Alabama during the Jim Crow era, Walter had faced racism his entire life. As a young man, he'd been denied jobs, turned away from restaurants, and even arrested once simply for sitting on a park bench reserved for whites only. Those experiences had taught him resilience, but they also left scars. Still, Walter believed in the goodness of people. He hoped that one day things would change, that maybe the world would see past skin color and treat everyone equally. Every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, Walter followed the same routine. He walked to the I-Das local grocery store a few blocks away to pick up essentials. On this particular Thursday, the sun was shining brightly, and a cool breeze rustled the leaves. Walter enjoyed these walks. They gave him time to think and reflect. He carried a reusable shopping bag slung over his shoulder and leaned lightly on his wooden cane as he strolled down the sidewalk. The streets were busy with kids playing outside, parents chatting on porches, and cars driving by. Everything seemed normal, or so Walter thought. As he turned onto Elm Street, heading back home with a bag of groceries in hand, evenly packed with bread, milk, and a few apples, he noticed something unusual. A black and white police car was parked near the corner, its engine idling. 2 officers sat inside, their eyes scanning the area. At first, Walter didn't pay much attention. Police cars weren't uncommon in the neighborhood, though they rarely stopped for anything serious. But then, as Walter continued walking, the car began moving slowly behind him. Its tires crunched against the gravel, matching his pace. Walter felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He told himself not to panic, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The car stayed close, following him for nearly half a block before finally pulling up alongside him. One of the officers rolled down the passenger side window and leaned out. "Hey you," the officer barked, his voice sharp and commanding. Walter froze mid-step, gripping his cane tightly. He turned toward the car, squinting against the sunlight. "Yes?" he replied calmly, trying to keep his tone polite. The officer narrowed his eyes, studying Walter like he was some sort of suspect. "What are you doing here?" the officer demanded, as if Walter's presence on the street required explanation. Walter blinked, taken aback by the question. "I'm just walking home," he said, gesturing toward the bag in his hand. "I went to the store." The officer exchanged a glance with his partner, who remained silent but wore a smirk on his face. Then, without warning, the passenger side door swung open and the officer stepped out. He was tall and broad-shouldered, towering over Walter's slight frame. "Walking home, huh?" the officer repeated mockingly. "You sure about that? This is a nice neighborhood. You live around here?" Walter nodded, clutching his cane tighter. "Yes, I do. I've lived here for over 20 years. The officer raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. 20 years? Really? He said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Funny, 'cause we get calls all the time about strangers lurking around here, people acting suspicious. Walter frowned, feeling a mix of confusion and indignation. Suspicious? Him? All he'd done was walk home from the store. What could possibly be suspicious about that? The officer circled around Walter, inspecting him from head to toe. "Let me see your ID," he ordered abruptly. Walter hesitated, unsure whether he was legally obligated to comply. Technically, He wasn't doing anything illegal, and he knew his rights. But experience had taught him that resisting authority often made things worse. Reluctantly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet, handing over his driver's license. The officer snatched it from his hand and examined it closely, muttering under his breath. Meanwhile, his partner got out of the car too, joining them on the sidewalk. Together, they loomed over Walter, creating an intimidating presence. "This, your bag?" the second officer asked, pointing to the groceries. Walter nodded again. "Yes, it is. I just bought those items from the store." The first officer smirked. "Oh yeah? Prove it." Walter sighed, growing increasingly frustrated. He opened the bag carefully and showed them the receipt tucked inside. The officers glanced at it briefly, then tossed it aside as if it meant nothing. "That doesn't prove anything," the first officer sneered. "Could have stolen this stuff and planted the receipt later." By now, a small crowd had gathered, nearby. Neighbors peeked out from their windows or stood on their porches, watching the scene unfold. Some looked concerned, while others appeared indifferent. Walter felt a wave of embarrassment wash over him. Here he was, a respected elder in the community, being treated like a criminal in broad daylight. He tried to reason with the officers, explaining that he was just an ordinary man going about his day. But every word he spoke seemed to irritate them further. "Listen, old man," the first officer snapped, leaning closer. "We're just doing our job. If you've got nothing to hide, why are you getting so defensive?" Walter swallowed hard, fighting back tears. He wanted to scream, to demand justice, but he knew better. Instead, he stood silently, praying that the ordeal would end soon. Little did he or the officers know that help was already on the way. Unbeknownst to anyone, Walter's son, Marcus Johnson, held a position of immense power. He was the director of the FBI. And when news of this incident reached him, everything was about to change. For Walter, for the officers, and perhaps for the entire system itself. The tension on the sidewalk was palpable. Walter stood rooted to the spot, his frail body trembling slightly as the officers continued their relentless interrogation. The first officer, whose nameplate read Officer Grayson, had taken charge of the situation, barking questions while his partner, Officer Miller, lingered nearby with a smug expression. They seemed determined to find fault with Walter, no matter how innocent his actions appeared. Every explanation Walter offered only fueled their suspicion, and every attempt to remain calm felt like fuel being poured onto an already raging fire. "You expect us to believe this is all yours?" Officer Grayson asked, holding up the grocery bag as though it were evidence of some grand crime. He rummaged through its contents carelessly, pulling out the loaf of bread and inspecting it as if searching for hidden contraband. Walter clenched his jaw but said nothing, knowing that responding would only make things worse. His silence, however, did not sit well with the officers. "Cat got your tongue, old man," Grayson sneered, tossing the bread back into the bag. "Or are you hiding something?" Walter's heart pounded in his chest. He wanted to defend himself, to tell them they were wasting their time harassing an elderly man who had done nothing wrong. But he feared escalating the situation. Instead, he focused on maintaining his composure, trying to project an air of dignity despite the humiliation washing over him. Still, the weight of their accusations gnawed at him. Why couldn't they see that he was just a regular person? A father, a grandfather, a neighbor. Did his age and race automatically brand him as guilty? As the minutes dragged on, the crowd of onlookers grew larger. Some people whispered among themselves, shaking their heads in disbelief. Others recorded the scene on their phones, capturing snippets of the confrontation to share online later. Among the bystanders was Mrs. Thompson, a longtime resident of the neighborhood and one of Walter's few close friends. She stepped forward cautiously, her voice soft but firm. "Is there a problem here, officers?" she asked, addressing Grayson directly. "Mr. Johnson lives right down the street. I've known him for years. He's a good man." Grayson shot her a dismissive glare. "Ma'am, this doesn't concern you," he said curtly. "Stay out of it." Mrs. Thompson hesitated, clearly torn between speaking up and avoiding trouble. Ultimately, she retreated to the sidelines, muttering under her breath about injustice. Her intervention, though brief, had planted a seed of doubt in the minds of some witnesses. If someone like Mrs. Thompson, a respected member of the community, vouched for Walter, why were the officers treating him so harshly? Meanwhile, Officer Miller decided to take matters into his own hands. Ignoring protocol entirely, he began patting Walter down, running his hands roughly over the old man's coat and trousers. Walter flinched at the intrusion, gripping his cane tighter for support. "What are you doing?" he protested weakly, his voice barely audible. "You can't do this." But Miller ignored him, laughing cruelly as he searched for non-existent weapons or drugs. When he found nothing, he turned to Grayson with a shrug. "Clean," he muttered, though his tone suggested disappointment rather than relief. Despite finding no incriminating evidence, the officers showed no signs of backing off. In fact, their behavior became even more aggressive. Grayson leaned in closer, his face inches from Walter's. "Listen carefully," he growled. "We get complaints about guys like you all the time, hanging around where you don't belong, making people uncomfortable. You understand what I'm saying?" Walter stared back at him, his eyes filled with quiet defiance. "I live here," he repeated firmly. "This is my home." Grayson scoffed, clearly unimpressed. "Yeah, sure. And we're supposed to take your word for it." He gestured toward the modest house visible a block away. "That dump belongs to you? Looks abandoned, if you ask me." Walter felt a surge of anger rise within him, but he forced himself to stay calm. Arguing wouldn't solve anything. It might even make things worse. Instead, he simply nodded toward the address plaque mounted near his front door. "Go check for yourself," he said evenly. "My name's on the mailbox." For a moment, it seemed like Grayson might actually consider investigating further. But then Miller chimed in, his tone mocking. "Why bother? We both know he's lying. Guys like him always lie." The comment drew snickers from a few onlookers, though most remained silent, visibly uncomfortable with the spectacle unfolding before them. Walter closed his eyes briefly, willing himself to block out the hostility surrounding him. He thought about his late wife, Evelyn, who had always encouraged him to stand tall in the face of adversity. What would she say if she could see him now? Just when it seemed like the ordeal might never end, a young woman approached the group, her phone raised high as she recorded the interaction. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. "Can you explain why you're stopping this man? He hasn't done anything wrong." Grayson shot her a warning look. "This is official police business," he snapped. "Mind your own affairs." Undeterred, the woman continued filming, zooming in on Walter's weary face. "I'm just documenting what's happening," she replied coolly. "People deserve to know when their rights are being violated." Her words struck a chord with several bystanders who began murmuring in agreement. Even Mrs. Thompson stepped forward again, emboldened by the young woman's courage. "That's right," she added. "Mr. Johnson hasn't broken any laws. Leave him alone." For the first time since the stop began, the officers looked uneasy. They exchanged glances, silently debating whether to continue or cut their losses. Finally, Grayson let out an exasperated sigh and signaled to Miller. "Fine," he muttered. "Let's give him a ticket for loitering and call it a day." Walter blinked in disbelief. Loitering? He had been walking home from the store, minding his own business, and now they were accusing him of loitering. It was absurd, yet he knew better than to argue. As Grayson scribbled on a pad of paper, preparing to issue the citation, Walter felt a mix of emotions swirling inside him: frustration, sadness, and above all, exhaustion. How many times had he endured similar indignities throughout his life? Too many to count. Yet somehow, this moment felt different, more personal, more unjust. Unbeknownst to anyone present, including Walter himself, the incident was far from over. While the officers busied themselves writing up the bogus ticket, a neighbor across the street picked up her phone and dialed a number she hadn't used in months. On the other end of the line, Marcus Johnson, the director of the FBI and Walter's son, answered immediately. Hearing the urgency in the caller's voice, Marcus listened intently as she described what was happening. By the time she finished, his blood was boiling. Without hesitation, he grabbed his keys, stormed out of his office, and headed straight for the neighborhood where his father had lived peacefully for decades. When Marcus arrived, the scene was exactly as the neighbor had described. 2 officers towering over his frail father, issuing a baseless ticket while a growing crowd watched in stunned silence. At first, Marcus blended into the background, observing quietly as the drama unfolded. But when Grayson handed the ticket to Walter with a condescending smirk, Marcus decided enough was enough. Stepping forward, he cleared his throat loudly, drawing everyone's attention. "Excuse me," he said, his deep voice commanding respect. "What seems to be the issue here?" The officers turned to face him, sizing him up quickly. To them, Marcus looked like just another concerned citizen, until they noticed the sharp suit, polished shoes, and authoritative demeanor that screamed power. Grayson frowned, sensing something was off. "Sir, this is police business," he said gruffly. "Please step back." Marcus crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. "Police business, huh?" he replied, raising an eyebrow. "Funny, because my father," he gestured toward Walter, "tells me he hasn't done anything wrong. Care to explain yourselves?" For a split second, confusion flickered across Grayson's face. Then realization dawned, and his eyes widened, in shock. "Your father?" he stammered, glancing between Marcus and Walter. Before Marcus could respond, Miller interjected nervously. "Wait, who are you?" Marcus fixed him with a piercing stare. "I'm Marcus Johnson," he stated plainly, "Director of the FBI." The words hit like a thunderclap. Both officers froze, their faces pale with panic as they realized the gravity of their mistake. Their harassment of an elderly black man had just landed them in the crosshairs of one of the most powerful figures in law enforcement, and there was no escaping the consequences. The moment Marcus introduced himself as the director of the FBI, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. The 2 officers, Grayson and Miller, who had been so confident and dismissive just moments earlier, suddenly looked like deer caught in headlights. Their faces turned pale, and their body language changed completely. Gone was the arrogance they had displayed while harassing Walter. Now they stood awkwardly, fumbling for words as they realized the enormity of their mistake. Marcus didn't waste any time. He stepped closer to the officers, his towering frame exuding authority. Despite his calm demeanor, there was an unmistakable edge to his voice. "Let me get this straight," he began, his tone sharp but controlled. "You stopped my father, an elderly man who has lived in this neighborhood for over 20 years, because he was walking home from the grocery store, and then you proceeded to accuse him of loitering?" Grayson swallowed hard, trying to regain some semblance of composure. "Sir, we were just doing our job," he stammered. "We got a call about suspicious activity in the area." Marcus raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Suspicious activity?" he echoed, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Walking home? With groceries is suspicious now? Or is it only suspicious when the person happens to be black?" The question hung heavy in the air, leaving the officers speechless. They exchanged nervous glances, unsure how to respond. Meanwhile, the crowd of onlookers grew larger, drawn by the unfolding drama. Some people whispered excitedly, recognizing Marcus from news reports or photographs. Others filmed the scene on their phones, capturing every word and gesture. Walter, still standing nearby with his cane in hand, watched the exchange in stunned silence. He hadn't expected his son to show up, let alone intervene so boldly. For years, Walter had kept his struggles private, not wanting to burden Marcus with the weight of racial discrimination. But seeing his son stand up for him, and for justice, filled him with a mix of pride and relief. Though the situation was far from resolved, Walter felt a small sense of vindication knowing that someone powerful was finally holding these officers accountable. Marcus turned his attention back to the officers, his piercing gaze locking onto Grayson. "Do you even realize what you've done here?" he asked, his voice rising slightly. "You violated the rights of an innocent man. You've disrespected someone who deserves dignity and respect, not because he's my father, but because he's a human being." Grayson opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, he fidgeted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. Miller, standing beside him, looked equally mortified, muttering something under his breath about following protocol. "Protocol?" Marcus repeated incredulously. "Is that what you call this? Humiliating an elderly man in front of his neighbors? Accusing him of crimes he didn't commit? Issuing a baseless ticket for loitering?" He shook his head in disgust. "If this is your idea of protecting and serving, then you've failed miserably." His words struck a chord with the onlookers, many of whom nodded in agreement. Even those who had initially been indifferent to the incident now seemed outraged by the officer's behavior. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Grayson tried to backtrack. "Sir, I assure you, we meant no harm," he said hastily, his voice trembling. "It was just a misunderstanding." Marcus cut him off immediately. "A misunderstanding?" He shot back, his tone icy. "No, Officer Grayson, this isn't a misunderstanding. This is racism, plain and simple. And if you think you can hide behind your badge to justify it, you're sorely mistaken." The crowd murmured in approval, some clapping softly while others cheered Marcus on. It was clear that the tide had turned against the officers. Seeing the growing support for Walter and Marcus, Mrs. Thompson stepped forward once again. "Mr. Johnson is right," she declared, addressing the officers directly. "What you did today was wrong. We all know Mr. Walter. He's a good man. There's no reason for you to treat him this way." Her words carried weight, especially since she was one of the most respected residents in the neighborhood. Other neighbors joined in, voicing their disapproval of the officer's actions. One man shouted, "Yeah, leave him alone. He hasn't done anything." Another woman added, "This kind of thing happens too often around here. It needs to stop." Faced with mounting pressure, Grayson and Miller looked increasingly desperate. They glanced at each other, silently debating whether to defend themselves or admit defeat. Finally, Grayson spoke up, though his voice lacked conviction. "Sir, we apologize if there was any misunderstanding," he said, addressing Marcus. "We'll make sure this doesn't happen again." Marcus stared at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, without saying a word, he pulled out his phone and dialed a number. "Apologies aren't enough," he said firmly. "Actions speak louder than words." On the other end of the line was the police chief of Chicago. Marcus wasted no time getting to the point. "Chief, I need you to listen carefully," he said, his voice steely. "Two of your officers, Grayson and Miller, just harassed my father, Walter Johnson, in broad daylight. They accused him of loitering, searched him without probable cause, and issued a bogus ticket. This isn't just misconduct, it's systemic. Racism, and I won't tolerate it." The line went silent for a moment before the chief responded, sounding flustered. "Director Johnson, I assure you, will look into this immediately," he promised. "These officers will be suspended pending an investigation." Hanging up the phone, Marcus turned back to the officers, who were visibly sweating now. "You're suspended," he informed them bluntly. "Effective immediately. Pack up your car and leave this neighborhood. Don't come back unless you're ready to face the consequences of your actions." Grayson and Miller hesitated for a second, then hurriedly climbed into their patrol car and sped away, eager to escape the humiliation. As the car disappeared down the street, the crowd erupted into applause, cheering for Marcus and Walter. Strangers approached Walter, shaking his hand and offering words of encouragement. For the first time in hours, he allowed himself to smile. But Marcus wasn't finished yet. He knew that punishing two rogue officers wouldn't solve the bigger problem: the deep-rooted racism within law enforcement. Determined to create lasting change, he called a press conference later that evening. Standing in front of cameras and reporters, he recounted the day's events, holding nothing back. "What happened to my father today is unacceptable," he stated passionately. "It's a reflection of a broken system that allows racial profiling and abuse of power to persist unchecked. As the director of the FBI, I'm committed to rooting out this corruption wherever it exists." His speech resonated deeply with the public, sparking outrage and calls for reform across the nation. Social media lit up with hashtags like "Yow" or "Justice for Walter," and racial profiling, amplifying the message far beyond Chicago. Civil rights organizations reached out to Marcus, offering their support and pledging to work alongside him to address systemic racism. Meanwhile, Walter became an unlikely symbol of resilience. Though he had endured decades of discrimination, he refused to let bitterness consume him. Instead, he embraced his newfound role as a voice for change, speaking at community meetings and inspiring others to stand up against injustice. Back at the FBI headquarters, Marcus launched an internal investigation into police misconduct, collaborating with civil rights leaders to develop policies aimed at increasing accountability and transparency. He also pushed for mandatory training programs designed to combat implicit bias among law enforcement officers. While progress was slow, the momentum was undeniable. People from all walks of life rallied behind the movement, demanding a fairer, more equitable society. As for Walter, he returned to his quiet life, grateful for the love and support of his family and neighbors. Though the incident left scars, it also strengthened his resolve to fight for a better future, not just for himself but for generations to come. Together, father and son proved that courage and determination could shine a light in even the darkest corners of injustice. And, though the road ahead would be long and challenging, they faced it with unwavering hope, knowing that change was possible, one step at a time. The press conference Marcus Johnson held that evening became a defining moment in the fight against racial injustice. Standing behind a podium adorned with the FBI seal, Marcus spoke with a clarity and conviction that captivated millions watching live on television and online. His words weren't just about what had happened to his father. They were a call to action, a demand for systemic reform in policing across America. Cameras flashed as reporters scribbled furiously, capturing every detail of his impassioned speech. "Today," Marcus began, looking directly into the cameras, "my father, a 76-year-old man who has lived peacefully in his neighborhood for over 2 decades, was harassed by police officers simply because of the color of his skin. He was accused of crimes he didn't commit, searched without probable cause, and humiliated in front of his community, all under the guise of protecting and serving. This isn't an isolated incident. It's part of a pattern, a culture, of racism and abuse of power that exists within law enforcement institutions nationwide." His voice grew stronger as he continued. "We cannot ignore this any longer. We must confront it head-on. As the director of the FBI, I am committed to ensuring accountability at every level. No badge, no rank, no position will shield individuals from facing consequences when they violate the rights of citizens. Justice is not negotiable." The crowd erupted in applause, many rising to their feet. Among them were civil rights activists, community leaders, and ordinary people who had been galvanized by Walter's story. For years, they had fought tirelessly against racial profiling and police brutality, often feeling like their voices went unheard. But now, with someone as powerful as Marcus leading the charge, they felt a renewed sense of hope. Social media platforms buzzed with reactions, hashtags like "Justice for Walter" trending worldwide. People shared videos of the press conference, along with stories of their own encounters with racial discrimination, creating a groundswell of support for change. In the days following the incident, Walter found himself thrust into the spotlight. Reporters camped outside his home, eager to hear his perspective. Neighbors knocked on his door to express solidarity, bringing food, flowers, and heartfelt notes. At first, Walter felt overwhelmed by the attention. He had always preferred a quiet life, avoiding the limelight. But as more people reached out, sharing how his story inspired them to speak up, he realized the importance of using his experience to drive meaningful change. One afternoon, a local pastor invited Walter to speak at a community meeting held at a nearby church. Hesitant but encouraged by Marcus, Walter agreed. That evening, the sanctuary was packed with residents from all walks of life, young and old, black and white, rich and poor. When Walter stepped onto the stage, leaning on his cane, the room fell silent. He took a deep breath before speaking, his voice steady despite the weight of emotion. "I never imagined I'd be standing here today," he began, pausing to gather his thoughts. I'm just an ordinary man, a father, a grandfather, a neighbor. I've worked hard my whole life, paid my taxes, raised my family, and tried to treat others with kindness. But throughout my life I've faced discrimination, not because of anything I did, but because of the color of my skin. His words resonated deeply with the audience, many nodding in agreement or wiping away tears. But let me tell you something, Walter continued, his tone growing firmer. Despite everything I refuse to hate. Hate only breeds more hate. What we need is understanding, compassion, and action. My son said it best. Justice isn't negotiable, and neither is equality. We deserve to live in a world where everyone is treated fairly, regardless of race, age, or background. That's why I'm asking each of you to join me in fighting for change, not just for me, but for future generations. When he finished speaking, the congregation erupted in applause, standing to honor him with a standing ovation. Walter smiled humbly, feeling a warmth in his heart he hadn't felt in years. For so long he had carried the pain of discrimination silently. Now he saw that sharing his story could inspire others to break their silence too. Meanwhile, Marcus wasted no time channeling public outrage into concrete action. Back at the FBI headquarters, he assembled a task force dedicated to investigating cases of racial profiling and police misconduct. The team included experts in criminal justice reform, data analysts, and representatives from civil rights organizations. Their goal was clear: identify patterns of discriminatory behavior within law enforcement agencies and hold perpetrators accountable. Marcus also reached out to lawmakers, urging them to introduce legislation aimed at increasing transparency and accountability in policing. One of his key proposals was the implementation of body cameras for all officers, coupled with strict penalties for tampering with footage. Another initiative focused on establishing independent oversight boards to review complaints against police departments. These measures, though controversial, gained traction thanks to the widespread public support sparked by Walter's case. Not everyone welcomed these efforts, however. Some police unions pushed back fiercely, arguing that increased scrutiny would hinder officers' ability to do their jobs effectively. Critics accused Marcus of being biased, claiming his personal connection to the incident clouded his judgment. Others dismissed the reforms as unnecessary, insisting that rogue officers were exceptions rather than indicative of a larger problem. But Marcus remained undeterred. During interviews and panel discussions, he addressed critics head-on, countering their arguments with facts and statistics. "If you're doing your job right," he told one skeptical journalist, "then there's nothing to fear from transparency. Accountability doesn't weaken law enforcement. It strengthens it. Officers who serve and protect deserve our respect, but that respect must be earned through integrity and fairness." As the national conversation around policing evolved, Walter and Marcus became symbols of resilience and perseverance. Together, they attended rallies, town hall meetings, and educational workshops, amplifying their message of justice and equality. They emphasized the importance of unity, encouraging communities to work together to dismantle systemic racism. Their partnership, a blend of Walter's wisdom and Marcus's authority, proved unstoppable. Behind the scenes, Marcus worked closely with federal agencies to ensure that Grayson and Miller faced appropriate consequences for their actions. Both officers were formally charged with misconduct and racial profiling, their careers effectively over. While some argued that punishment alone wasn't enough to address the root causes of such behavior, Marcus insisted it was a necessary step toward accountability. "You can't fix a broken system without holding individuals responsible," he explained during a televised interview. These officers made choices. They chose to discriminate, to abuse their power. Those choices have consequences. In addition to pursuing legal action, Marcus launched a nationwide campaign to educate the public about racial bias and its impact on marginalized communities. Schools, universities, and workplaces signed up for training programs designed to promote empathy and understanding. Public service announcements aired on major networks, featuring testimonials from victims of racial profiling and calls to report incidents of discrimination. Slowly but surely, the movement gained momentum. reaching corners of society previously untouched by discussions of race and inequality. For Walter, the transformation was profound. What had started as a humiliating ordeal had turned into a catalyst for change. Though the scars of that day lingered, he found solace in knowing that his experience had ignited a broader conversation. Strangers stopped him on the street to thank him for speaking out, while letters poured in from across the country, expressing gratitude and admiration. Even journalists, who had once doubted the significance of his story, now hailed him as a hero. Yet, Walter remained humble, deflecting praise whenever possible. "I'm no hero," he often said with a chuckle. "I'm just a man who refused to stay silent. If my story helps even one person stand up for themselves, then it was worth it." His selflessness endeared him to countless admirers, further fueling the movement for racial justice. By the end of the year, tangible progress had been made. Several states passed laws mandating body cameras for police officers, while cities established civilian oversight boards to monitor law enforcement practices. Federal funding was allocated to train officers in de-escalation techniques and cultural sensitivity. Though challenges remained, the trajectory was undeniable. The tide was turning. For Marcus and Walter, the journey was far from over. They knew that true equality required sustained effort, patience, and unwavering determination. But as they stood side by side, one a seasoned elder, the other a powerful leader, they faced the future with optimism. Through courage, collaboration, and an unyielding commitment to justice, they had proven that change was possible. And in doing so, they had given countless others the courage to believe in a brighter tomorrow. Months after the incident that changed everything, Walter Johnson found himself sitting on the porch of his modest home, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The air was crisp, carrying with it the faint scent of autumn leaves. It had been a long journey, one filled with pain, resilience, and ultimately, triumph. But Walter felt a deep sense of peace. His life had returned to its quiet rhythm, though it was now punctuated by moments of purpose he never imagined possible. Neighbors still stopped by frequently, not just to check on him, but to thank him for inspiring them to take a stand against injustice. Strangers wrote letters sharing how his story gave them hope. And yet, despite all the attention, Walter remained grounded, always reminding himself that he was simply an ordinary man who happened to spark something extraordinary. Inside the house, Marcus sat at the kitchen table, reviewing reports from the task force he had assembled. The work was far from easy. Dismantling systemic racism within law enforcement required patience, persistence, and collaboration. But Marcus was determined. Every day he pushed forward, driven by the memory of seeing his father humiliated on that sidewalk. He couldn't erase the image of Walter standing there, frail and dignified, as two officers treated him like a criminal. That moment fueled his resolve to create lasting change, not just for Walter, but for everyone who had ever faced similar injustices. The national conversation around racial profiling and police misconduct had grown louder than ever before. Thanks in large part to Walter's story, people were no longer willing to turn a blind eye to discrimination. Protests erupted in cities across the country, demanding accountability and reform. Lawmakers introduced sweeping legislation aimed at addressing inequities in policing practices. One landmark bill, inspired by Marcus's proposals, mandated nationwide use of body cameras and established independent oversight committees to investigate complaints against officers. Though critics argued that such measures would undermine law enforcement, public support for the reforms was overwhelming. People wanted transparency, and they weren't backing down until they got it. Marcus played a pivotal role in shaping these policies, testifying before Congress and working closely with civil rights organizations. His position as FBI director gave him a platform few others possessed, and he used it wisely. During one particularly memorable hearing, Marcus addressed skeptical lawmakers, his voice steady and commanding. "This isn't about punishing police officers," he said. "It's about protecting communities. It's about ensuring that every citizen, regardless of race, age, or background, is treated with dignity and respect. If we can't agree on that basic principle, then we've failed as a society. His words resonated deeply, earning applause from both sides of the aisle. Even some of his staunchest opponents began to soften their stance, recognizing the urgency of the issue. Slowly but surely, progress was made. Police departments across the country adopted new training programs focused on cultural sensitivity and de-escalation techniques. Recruitment efforts emphasized diversity, aiming to build forces that better reflected the communities they served. While challenges remained, the momentum was undeniable. Change was happening, and it was happening because people refused to stay silent. Back in Chicago, Walter became a beloved figure in the community. Schools invited him to speak to students about resilience and the importance of standing up for what's right. Community centers hosted events celebrating his courage, turning his humble story into a beacon of hope. At first, Walter hesitated to accept these invitations, feeling unworthy of the praise. But Marcus encouraged him, reminding him that his voice mattered. "Dad," Marcus said one evening, placing a hand on Walter's shoulder, "you've spent your whole life teaching me to be strong, to do the right thing even when it's hard. Now it's your turn to teach others." Walter took those words to heart. Whether speaking to a classroom of eager young faces or addressing a packed auditorium, he shared his experiences openly and honestly. He talked about growing up during the Jim Crow era, facing racism in its most brutal forms and learning to rise above hatred. He spoke about the importance of forgiveness, not because offenders deserved it, but because holding on to bitterness only weighed you down. And he urged listeners to channel their anger into action, to fight for justice without losing sight of compassion. One of Walter's most impactful appearances came at a youth summit held in downtown Chicago. Hundreds of teenagers gathered to discuss issues affecting their generation, from gun violence to climate change. When Walter stepped onto the stage, leaning heavily on his cane, the room fell silent. For a moment, he simply looked out at the sea of young faces, marveling at their energy and determination. Then, with a warm smile, he began to speak. "Young people," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "the world needs you now more than ever. You have the power to shape the future, to make it brighter, fairer, and more just. Don't let anyone tell you your voice doesn't matter, because it does. Every time you stand up for someone being treated unfairly, every time you call out injustice, you're making the world a better place." The audience erupted in cheers, many rising to their feet. Afterward, dozens of students lined up to meet Walter, shaking his hand and thanking him for his words. Some shared their own stories of discrimination, while others asked for advice on how to effect change. Walter listened patiently, offering encouragement and wisdom wherever he could. By the end of the event, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. These young people were the future, and if they carried the torch of justice, then true equality was within reach. As the months turned into years, the impact of Walter and Marcus's efforts continued to grow. The reforms they championed became ingrained in law enforcement practices, leading to measurable improvements in community relations. Incidents of racial profiling declined significantly, thanks in part to increased accountability and transparency. Independent oversight boards gained credibility, earning the trust of citizens who had long felt powerless against systemic abuse. Body cameras, once controversial, became standard equipment for officers nationwide, providing irrefutable evidence in cases of misconduct. But perhaps the most profound change was cultural. Conversations about race and inequality, once taboo, became commonplace. Families discussed these issues around dinner tables. Schools incorporated lessons on civil rights history into their curriculums. Workplaces prioritized diversity and inclusion, striving to create environments where everyone felt valued. Slowly but surely, society began to shift, a testament to the power of collective action. For Marcus, the journey reinforced his belief in the importance of leadership. As FBI director, he faced countless challenges, from high-profile investigations to political pressures. Yet none of them compared to the personal stakes of fighting for his father's dignity. Through it all, Marcus learned that true leadership wasn't about wielding authority. It was about serving others, using your platform to amplify marginalized voices, and refusing to back down in the face of adversity. He often reflected on how much he owed to Walter, whose quiet strength had shaped him into the man he was today. As for Walter, he embraced his role as a symbol of resilience, knowing that his legacy extended beyond his family. He had shown the world that courage didn't require grand gestures. It could be found in the simple act of standing tall, even when the odds were stacked against you. Though he never sought fame or recognition, he accepted it gracefully, using his newfound influence to inspire others. In doing so, he proved that one person's courage could ignite a movement capable of transforming an entire nation. Years later, when historians looked back on this period, they would point to Walter and Marcus Johnson as catalysts for change. Their story, a father harassed by police, a son rising to defend him, and a community rallying behind them, became a powerful reminder of the enduring fight for justice. It was a story of pain and perseverance, of anger turned into action, and of love conquering hate. And though the road ahead remained long and challenging, Walter and Marcus knew they had laid the foundation for a brighter future. On a chilly, winter evening, as snowflakes drifted lazily from the sky, Walter and Marcus sat together on the porch sipping hot cocoa. They didn't speak much, content to simply enjoy each other's company. But as the sun set, casting a golden glow over the neighborhood, Walter broke the silence. "You know," he said softly, "I never thought my little walk to the store would lead to all this." Marcus smiled, placing a hand on his father's shoulder. "Neither did I, Dad. But I'm glad it did. Because of you, the world is starting to wake up." Walter chuckled, his eyes twinkling with pride. "Well," he said, leaning back in his chair, "if waking up means treating folks right, then maybe there's hope for us after all." And with that, father and son sat in comfortable silence, knowing they had done their part to light the way toward a more just and equitable world.